I think everyone who has played the Resident Evil games will agree that the modern Resident Evil games are worse than the early ones in quite a few aspects, and I'm pretty sure some of you even vastly prefer the older ones over the new ones. By the way, my video about this topic went absolute bonkers as well, so thanks a lot for that, guys, I really appreciate it. But anyway, this time I want to talk about the opposite and showcase that not everything is just a disappointment. Might be something some Silent Hill fans should consider for once. So why are the modern Resident Evil games better than the old ones, in certain aspects? Probably something that is overlooked quite often by people is the accessibility, and that actually includes a lot of different things that are basically all better than in the early Resident Evil games. I mean, hell, you couldn't even buy some of the early Resident Evil games until GOG started releasing them 2 months ago, and that are still not all, because the spin-offs and Code Veronica were not even ported to PC or completely lost and broken like Resident Evil Survivor. Even console exclusives basically don't exist anymore, in opposite to the late 90s and early 2000s when most games were available on only 1 or maybe 2 platforms. Today literally everything is available on anything. I mean, they even released the games on smartphones. The games could only be more accessible if you could buy them on your Samsung bespoke 4-door flex refrigerator with AI Family Hub plus AI Vision inside in white glass. It's also important to note that the PC ports of the early games were super hard to run on modern computers before the classic Rebirth patches and the GOG releases came around. And I still can't properly play Resident Evil 1 with the classic Rebirth patch because AMD GPUs apparently have these weird ass graphic bugs. Another similar aspect is the expanded language support. In the PS1 era, games were often only available in English and Japanese, at least in the case of Capcom. Today we literally get everything. Leon can even be a French baguette! Wait, that actually isn't something that is better. Sorry guys, wrong list. But to be serious, it's great how many different languages are available for both the subtitles and even the voice acting. And I'm sure many people who can speak English or Japanese greatly appreciate it. Probably a lot more controversial for you hardcore survival horror fans are the objective marks that tell you vaguely what to do. Most survival horror games, including the early Resident Evil games, rely on either just telling you nothing or provide some cryptic instructions on weird notes or similar. I understand that some people may see that as hand-holding and dislike it, but I think it's a great addition that is especially helpful for new players that aren't familiar with survival horror games. Because let's be honest, we've all been stuck at least once in our first survival horror game. I mean, apart from me. The next point has to do with your ears. And I'm sure you can already guess what it is if you played these games with some decent headphones. Because exactly, I am talking about the satisfying sound of headshots and bodies that rip apart. But no, seriously, the sound design is great. In my video that is basically the reverse idea of this one, I talked about how I prefer the very prominent soundtrack of the old games, and I haven't suddenly changed my opinion just because I don't have anything else to write about. Because this time I mean just the sound design of everything else. The background noises of enemies when chilling in the RPD main hall, the great sounding guns that you use to obliterate everything.
Sorry.
And even the sound of the footsteps and the whole environment in general, that are just very immersive. Especially because the recent games also support 3D audio, so it literally sounds like you're in the middle of all that and less like you are playing a video game. The sound design in the early games is far from bad and actually very good and immersing as well, especially for the time, but the depth of all the sound that is possible today with modern game engines still beat them easily. Just staying in one place and listening to the background is already a great experience, while staying in one place in the early games is like listening to the Resident Evil soundtrack on YouTube. Not saying that this isn't a great experience, but it feels less real and I really appreciate the sound design of the newer games. But that's not the only thing I appreciate. According to my YouTube analytics, a lot of you haven't subscribed yet, even though you watch my videos. So if you're enjoying this video so far, please do so. I would appreciate it a lot and it will greatly support me. But of course only if you want to. Thanks either way and let's go to the next point. The length. I have to admit, I don't know exactly how long the average game was back then, because I wasn't born yet, but the first 3 games are pretty short. My first playthroughs of Resident Evil 1 and 2 both only took about 4 hours each, and Resident Evil 3 wasn't much longer with 5 hours. I mean, fair enough, I played with door skips, so it would be a bit more otherwise, but it's still not particularly long, especially considering that we live in a time where the Resident Evil 3 remake is vastly criticized for being too short, while actually not being that much shorter than the original. I actually needed around the same time for both games. I feel like the recent games are just a bit longer on average and in general a better length as well. And I haven't forgotten that the early games were extremely replayable with different characters like Jill and Chris, different scenarios that differentiate themselves like in Resident Evil 2, or a lot of RNG and different choices like in Resident Evil 3. But everyone has to admit that the recent games are just as replayable. It's a bit different than before because there's usually just one character, and the Resident Evil 2 and 3 remake ditched the zapping and choice system, but in place of all that there are now more challenges, more unlockables, and it's easier to track and improve your final game time. Apart from that, they also added the bonus shop in the Resident Evil 3 remake that is present in every game since then. That includes all that in a simple and easily trackable way, while in the originals you often don't even know what unlockables exist. So all this leads to the Resident Evil games having a pretty good length for the first playthrough, because they are neither too short nor too long, while also providing a lot of content after that motivates to keep playing the game. The next point is very obvious, because you can literally see it. I know, I'm not talking about the reflection you see of yourself right now. I'm talking about the graphics. And yeah, I'm the guy who loves the aesthetics of the old games, and yeah, I love fixed camera angles, and yeah, that point might sound a bit dumb and generic, but hear me out. You have to admit that the recent games look absolutely gorgeous with an insane amount of detail in literally every aspect. Well, maybe apart from the hair and reflections. The environments look great, and I found myself appreciating the view regularly in especially Village and the Resident Evil 4 remake. The character and enemy models are super detailed and look a lot more realistic than the almost robotic movement in the early games. And the use of lightning and shadows is obviously miles above the PS1 games, which didn't even have real lightning or shadows. I mean, don't get me wrong, I love the visuals of the early games, and I will prefer a good PS1 looking game over a bad realistic looking game, but the modern Resident Evil games are stunning, and it's unfair not to mention that, because they arguably look better overall. The vast majority of you will probably agree with my last aspect, the voice acting.
That was too close. You were almost a Jill sandwich.
You're right.
I think that is not even a contest. Resident Evil 1's voice acting is entertaining and funny, but apart from that, just not really good. It misses the tone of the game, sounds unprofessional, and most of the time outright bad. And even though they improved that a lot in every single game they published in that time, it always remained a bit unprofessional and unnatural. The first game that really fixed that was the original Resident Evil 4, at least in my opinion. But anyway, today is the complete opposite. Basically every character sounds great, highly professional and authentic. The quality of the dialogue also improved a lot over the last 20 years, so that's no longer an issue as well. I don't think anyone will seriously argue that anything before Resident Evil 4 has better voice acting than what we have today. So this actually might be one of the most indisputable improvements of the recent games. So what do you think of all that? What do you prefer in the modern Resident Evil games over the older ones? Please let me know in the comments. Also make sure to subscribe and like the video if you enjoyed it. Thanks a lot and see you next time.